You're listening to Mark of the Maker. Hey everybody, I'm Mark Steiner, and you're listening to Mark of the Maker. This is episode 49 of the show, and another interview episode, which everybody seems to enjoy. This time we have a very interesting guest who has a very cool and different perspective, I think, and a very different background than many of our previous guests, which often seems the case. So let's check in with our crew. Unfortunately, we're missing Mr. Tom Crine today. Oh, maybe not. There he is.
What's up?
Wow. Hey. We were just getting ready to record without Tom, and surprise, out of the shadows, he appears.
Shit. Damn, that's rough, man.
I love you, buddy. You know it.
I tried another computer, so.
Okay, well.
I'm on my shipping computer now.
Shipping computer.
What the hell, right?
Remember that. Write that down, Tom. In case of doubt, move to the shipping computer.
Maybe call it the podcast computer.
Yeah, exactly. Put a sign above it. Mark of the Maker computer. All right, so we have Mr. Tom Crine. We also have Mr. Sean Kendrick.
Hello.
All right, and we have Mr. Michael Birch.
Here.
Okay, and then this time around, I'm not sure exactly how to describe her, but I think she calls herself a scissor maker. We've talked about this person lots of times in the past on the show and her very, very incredible work, and that's Miss Grace Horne.
Hello.
And Grace is coming to us all the way from the UK.
Yes, indeed.
A very extra fabulous episode. This is our first, is this our first worldwide episode, guys? I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm honored.
We are honored.
We are. Well, some people don't realize that we're not all in the same room when we record, and I think most people have figured it out by now. But so we're usually fairly, I wouldn't say nationwide is probably an overstatement. Midwest-wide maybe would be a safer way to say it. So it's very cool to have you join us, Grace. Thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure.
All right. So, Grace, am I accurate in calling you a scissor maker? I know you make lots of other things as well, but...
It's always hard, isn't it, to define yourself. When people ask me what I do, my first question is, what day of the week is it? Because I don't seem to have an average day or a day that I'm doing something for any length of time. Actually, interestingly enough, a few years ago, I was asked by Women in Engineering to go and give a talk to school-age children, particularly girls, to talk to them about engineering and encourage them to get into that field. And they called me a craft engineer.
Really?
Which was really bizarre. I mean, they had electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, structural engineers, and they're all kind of doing talks. But they introduced me as a craft engineer. And it was the first time I'd ever heard that. And I thought, well, that's not helpful to anybody who doesn't know what I do. But actually, it's a really accurate description of what I do, right, because that encompasses everything, whether it's textiles or metalwork or cooking, anything. It has that same approach. And that's a kind of craft engineering point of view. Absolutely spot on.
Yeah.
I like that.
Craft engineering. I've never heard of that either. That's a very interesting description. Okay. So like we said, you make lots of stuff other than scissors. Scissors is kind of how you came up on our show, was talking about speaking with you and looking at your work at Blade Show. I think we're all kind of fascinated by the work that you do, but let's kind of do the normal timeline thing and talk about your history and background and help people understand how you got to the spot you are now, making lots of different things. So are you a lifelong UK person, Grace?
No, I was born in Australia.
Oh, okay.
We moved to the UK when I was 7, and my father was an architect. So the house always had a very aesthetic kind of resonance about it. We had nicely designed furniture and interesting things around. But when he moved to the UK, it was to become a farmer. It was to kind of jack everything in, They bought 25 acres, and they were basically hippies, so they wanted to be self-sufficient. My mother gardened, and my father kind of worked on the farm, and it was mainly sheep. So they had knives, pocket knives around them. My mother had a gardening knife, and my father always had a pocket knife on him. And when I was looking at what I was going to do as a career, actually I did look at engineering, and I can't remember now why I decided to go into a more of an art-based approach. When I did my degree, that was in craft design and technology. In the final year, I had to choose a metalwork project to do. And I discovered by then that jewellery was a little bit frivolous for me. It was a little bit small. It was a little bit fussy. There was there wasn't enough things that needed to, you could do anything in jewellery and call it jewellery.
Right.
It was just felt a little bit open-ended. And I had discovered by that stage that I really liked working in the engineering shop, on the milling machine, on the lathe, and making things precise. So for my final project, I did a set of 3 folding knives. And this was really because years ago, my father lost his pocket knife. And it must have only been a cheap Sheffield rosewood knife, because that was all he'd pick up from the Farmers Co-op. But no other knife he ever had lived up to the mythical properties of that lost knife. And when I started talking to him about what made it so good, why these didn't kind of live up to them, they must have switched supplier, and they now had stainless steel blades. This sounds very familiar, doesn't it? This was maybe the early 80s, so they were cheap Sheffield stainless steel blades, and they just weren't as good as the carbon steel knives that he'd had previously. Now, he'd had some experience he'd had some work over in the Middle East when he was qualifying, and he'd become very interested in Persian crafts. And I don't know where the quote about Richard the Lionheart and his Damascus sword came from, but there was a book in Dad's library on Persian arts and crafts that had a small description in it about Damascus steel. And it wasn't very helpful. It really, in hindsight, it was just the sort of misinformation that, was around at that time. But, it started me wondering what made steel good. So my first experience of knives was I wanted to make pocket knives. They had to be folding knives, and I wanted to make them out of Damascus steel.
Wow.
Never mind about starting with nice, straightforward fixed blades or anything like that. No, just throw myself into it. And it's with a sheer optimism of ignorance that I approach most of my projects, actually. That is, in hindsight, that is very like my approach to all my projects. Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing sometimes, right? It lets things happen that can't happen otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah. So I contacted Sheffield and asked them whether there was anybody still around making folding knives. I contacted the Cutler's Hall, and they didn't know of anybody who was still making pocket knives. So I took knives apart and had a look at them, and I basically made 3 folding knife-shaped objects. I did make Damascus steel, actually. I went down to Richard Cornell down in Leatherhead, and he was chairman of British Artist Blacksmiths at the time. And I said I wanted him to make the Damascus steel, and he kind of went, "No, it's really simple. Come down and do it with me."
Awesome.
Which I did. And it was a really simple, low-layer Damascus steel. And I was so proud of myself. I was 19 at the time. And that was the first forging I'd ever done, the first introduction to steel. and he just talked me through the process, held my hand every step of the way, and I ended up with material that I could then use and heat treat at the university.
Wow. Yeah, you went in way deep into the deep end.
Was it at that point that you kind of were drawn into steel and what you can make with it at that point, the metalworks? Is that what kind of hooked you?
Yes, I think the thing that I love most about Damascus steel is I've over the years I've become aware that my weak points are color. I don't do a huge amount with color and surface pattern. I'm not very good with surface pattern, but the fact that Damascus steel, the pattern that you get on the outside, is the manifestation of the internal structure. And therefore it tells a story about what has happened to the material in the past and how it's been handled and how it's been treated. That appeals to me. I love that. I think that's really fascinating, and it still fascinates me now. And that idea of pattern manipulation, and I love it in a way that an applied pattern just doesn't do it for me.
Well, it's like a window. It's kind of like, it's the same reason I like Hamones and stuff. It's a window into its heat treat. You get to see the parts of it. And I think with Damascus, it's almost like the mythology of it too. You know, the history of it is also very intriguing. It makes it become bigger than it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find it, because I did some work on the history of Damascus, and also the joy of trying to tease out the terminologies for my PhD thesis, and just finding out how that it was a solution to a problem. And of course, that's now been taken so far away from the initial problem. But the fact that you have a similar problem with Viking smiths and Javanese swordsmiths and the Japanese, and how they've all taken a similar issue of having two disparate types of steel, and then when you join them together, you get lines in it, and how they then handle it and turn it into an art form in its own right. Yeah.
Right, where it was created for functional need and evolved into functional beauty, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So these pocket knives that you built, Grace, they were for your undergraduate? Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I did those in 91. I was debating whether I was actually going to put a date on it. Yeah.
We can edit it out. Just let you know.
Okay. Actually, if you can say 81, and then they can go, gosh, she's looking good for 60. that would definitely be an
No
improvement.
worries, we got it.
So that was my final year undergraduate project, and I went to London and had a workshop there for a while, not doing anything knife related. It was actually working with pewter instead, which it was horrible. Oh, pewter is just the pits. It's everything that steel isn't. It's soft and it's easy, and it kind of does weird things. At least with steel, it might be hard and challenging to work with, but you've done it and it stays, and it has an honesty that pewter doesn't. And I am sorry for all those pewter enthusiasts out there, but
We have a lot of listeners that you're just making upset. Our pewter contingency.
Yeah, our pewter fan base is huge.
yeah, sorry, pewter fan base, but it's dirty, and we'll not go there. But while I was down there, I heard a radio program that was about the last little master of Sheffield. And he's called Stan Shaw. And I thought, they lied to me. There are people who are still making pocket knives in Sheffield. So, again, here we go. Do some research, Grace? No. I tell you what, hand in your notice at your accommodation and your workshop and move up to Sheffield.
It's the obvious choice.
It is the obvious choice. Well, I'd tried to contact him. I'd found he was still alive, but he wasn't answering me. Oh, I don't take rejection very well. So I moved up to Sheffield and camped on his doorstep. And he had a little workshop in the centre of Sheffield. And he was actually in Garden Street. and he was actually sharing it with an old scissor maker, and I didn't realize the significance at the time. I would have. I was ignoring the scissor maker because he'd actually said to me, Stan had said he was too old to take on an apprentice because he was 70. And anyway, the scissor maker didn't want a female in the workshop.
Oh, wow.
And it was a small workshop space, to be fair. But that's the only time that I've ever had anything negative about my gender. And in hindsight, it was absolutely no problem at all, because Stan sent me away with a whole load of springs and blades and told me to figure it out myself because it wasn't that hard. And there's a story about those blades. Those blades, I still have them. Okay, so he basically gave me this big tub of blades and said, have a look through these, kind of like huge drum of blades. Look through these and pick ones that you like the look of. These are all hand-forged blades from 150 years ago that have never been made up into pocket knives.
Oh, wow.
They still have the final nib on them from the forging, that, you know, and they are forged so close to final shape that they really need the bare minimum of grinding. And even at the time I thought, I can't use these for scrap. I can't learn on these. So they are still sitting here waiting for the day when I am good enough to turn them into knives.
Wow. That's really cool. So
Yes.
what I'm stuck on, okay, so you had a job, you were making pewter things. How did you even get to that job before you moved on to go on your knife adventure?
It was I can't remember. It was a long time ago. I think it was a graduate program thing.
Okay.
Where they were shifting people into crafts and pairing up established craft workers with new graduates.
Part of a placement or kind of a thing out of school. Okay. Yeah. And so the knife thing happened. You made the choice any logical person would, which is throw it all away and go on an adventure. And and you left your inquiry with a bucket of blades and parts.
Well, actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because when I left London, I realised that I didn't want to earn my living doing metalwork, because I realised that this was about I'd been working with pewter for over a year. I realised that there are a couple of things. I'm a very social person, and working in a workshop on your own, churning out stuff for a shop that wants it, means that you don't have time to socialise with other people. You're too busy working. That you can't do the stuff that you dreamed of the other day, because actually you need to be doing the vase that somebody else designed a year ago, because that's what is needed, you know. And actually I could see very quickly that if I stayed doing that, I would end up hating the thing that I loved the most, which was the metalwork. So when I moved to Sheffield, I decided that I was going to get a whole load of other jobs that would pay the bills. And at that stage, I was going to absolutely keep my metalwork and my creative practice as something that wasn't money driven. And in hindsight, that's probably the most fundamental thing that I did. It's so attractive when you start off doing your craft practice to become good at it, and then friends say, "Oh, you're very good at it. You could earn money doing that." So you start selling them, and then that's fine, and you start selling a bit more, and then somebody says, "Oh, you could go full time," and we do put it in the kind of hierarchy when we look at people doing crafts. Those full time makers we put at the top, and then the hobbyist makers are right at the bottom, the amateurs. And I think it's about time that we kind of reconsidered that a little bit, and it's not from the other makers. This comes from the establishment, from the gallery owners and that sort of thing, as much as kind of people within the craft community as a whole. It's almost like our craft skills are validated by our ability to turn them into a business.
Right.
It
legitimizes.
Yeah. And I think that, and then when people fail, their craft business fails, they feel like they've failed as a craftsperson. But actually, there are so many people out there who are awesome craftspeople who are just crap businessmen.
Yeah.
We see that a lot, actually.
I resemble that statement.
And I think that we should be brave enough to separate the two and say, my craft skills are amazing, but my business sense is terrible.
Yeah, I think.
And I would rather earn a living and resent having to go. I did all sorts of things. I worked as a night office cleaner. I worked as a tailor. I did, I temped in kind of in a bank for a while. I even no, I'll not put that in. Oh, you might have to edit that out. I actually applied for a job as a foam wrestler.
Oh wow.
Oh, yeah, that was I didn't get accepted. Apparently they weren't looking for somebody who was a black belt in karate. They were wanting somebody buxom and kind of willing to take their clothes off in a lunchtime in a working men's bar. God, who'd have thought it? I misread that job ad.
Oh, wow. No, it's a great point. I've had that experience. We've talked about it, I think, on the show. Certainly Michael and I have talked together about this before, where it's one thing to have something that you really enjoy and love, in whether it's craft or otherwise, right? There's lots of other things as well where this is maybe you call it a hobby or whatever, right? Something that I do that I really, really like. And there's this progression, like you said, where it could turn into a business or an attempt at a business. And anytime it's turned into something that has any real connection to making money, for me, that's where it wrecks the pleasurable part of it, right? It's like, this falls apart if you're not careful, right?
It absolutely can.
Yeah.
And people burn out so quickly, and I think that's the saddest thing when you see a new maker or even an old maker who then decides to go full time, and then you hear in a year or 2 years that they're just complete. They're a shell of their former self because everything has been sucked out of them.
Right. I get that feeling sometimes, and it's like you made a choice to hold what you feel passionate about to yourself, and to hold it close. And I feel like once you go full time or you do the thing that is that natural progression, you're letting your passion out to everybody, and it's harder. It's harder that way.
I think so all three of our other makers, right? Michael, Tom, and Sean, they're all full time, and I think. We've talked on the show a few times in the past about how, Grace and I, before we recorded, when we were going through the setup thing, we talked a little bit about, distraction projects, right? Or things that take you off the main path. And I think it seems like, and you guys can tell me if this is wrong, we've talked before that's something that you guys need to help you keep your sanity and keep the love for it alive, is to go off and do an oddball project or spend some time working on something fun or working an idea out of your head when, yes, you need to do things to pay the bills as well. But if you don't include those other things, it can turn into a grind that you really dread.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say it's probably 50% of my work, because sometimes if I don't have it, it's either that or go do something else, like, become a wrestler.
I don't want to... foam wrestler, I'll have to know. It's not like mud wrestling. It wasn't dirty.
It wasn't like pewter wrestling.
Apparently it was supposed to be.
I've now come reconciled to the fact that actually I'm an incredibly self-indulgent maker. And that's just the way I am. And that, yeah, I'm happy with that. That seems to feed my creativity, and actually that gives rise to a lot of the stranger projects that I do.
Well, honestly, Grace, I think all three of us probably envy you on that.
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's a very privileged position to be in, if I'm honest. And I try not to be too smug about it, but it's absolutely perfect. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not
Wouldn't
smug
trade
when
it
it's
for anything.
fact.
It's interesting, I think, because different people have different versions of that thing that keeps them moving forward. I think anyway. And in the case of our group of people here, they might be similar things, but for example, right, like Michael, will go work on a shape, right, or he'll spend a bunch of time working on design, I think, right, because that's something that really gets him excited, or go work on a new pattern that he doesn't really need to work on, right? Is that a fair summary, Michael? Or
Oh yeah, there's so many things that I just take tangents off and do, and something that kind of just feels creative versus feels like work, I guess.
Yeah, and in Tom's case, Tom, for you, it's kind of like maybe not such a huge stray from your normal path, right?
Right.
It's more like work on a batch of knives that you've been really wanting to do that have been sitting, and they grab your attention, and that's what you go after, and that seems like part of what keeps you interested. Is that fair, or what would you say is the piece of it that kind of cleanses your brain?
Mark, I don't know. I mean, I enjoy, like, I did a Q&A today, and one of the questions was, what do you enjoy the most? And honestly, I kind of enjoy all the parts of it. I don't mind when I'm drilling holes for handles or grinding blades or any of it. So the fact that, I do it all, I switch around a little bit, and that keeps me pretty interested. Every once in a while, I want to work on a new design or something, and I'll take a break for a day or so. But usually I'm pretty okay just staying in my grind, which, we're talking about not ethics, but work styles. And it's interesting because all three of us have a really solid work ethic, but we do it in a different way. So it's pretty cool.
Right.
Do you have different projects on the go at the same time? Or do you have one project that you're seeing through from the start to the finish, and then you start thinking about the next one? Do you know?
That at any given time, I've probably got between 30 and 50 knives in process in the shop.
Mm.
He's the productive one of us.
Yeah. I can't multitask like that. If I'm doing one of my projects, I have to be doing that. I can't then be thinking about. So I get quite embedded in the project that I'm working on. And if I let myself get distracted by the next one, or if I think, well, I'm going to have to shelve this for a while until I don't know, get new pin stock or, what have you, then there's every chance that I might not go back to it. But I can work on a project for weeks, tiny filing, day after day after day, much longer than I would have ever have thought that I would have patience for. But as soon as I start thinking about another project, I want to be working on that one then.
Yeah.
That sounds very familiar. That's that type of minutia I can get into and just single-mindedly focus on that. But then if something interrupts it, I get very frustrated. I feel like nothing should interrupt that. And I just don't like it.
At the same time, I think your guys' work reflects that. We've talked about this before. I feel like I'm sometimes more of a craftsman than an artist, and I definitely feel you guys are more artists than craftsmen. I mean, you're obviously craftsmen, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
I have a problem with the art craft design divide.
Yeah,
because
I think we're all craftsmen, all artists, but I think sometimes one or the other shines more through our work.
Yeah, I would put myself firmly in the craftsman camp, mainly because a lot of my pieces are material driven. So I will have started with fascination with the material, whether it be a new material or one that I've worked with before. I kind of think that if it's going to be an art piece, then it's going to be, I don't know, telling a story or being a bit more conceptual or having a bit more kind of background depth kind of oh,
I
I'm
kinda
going to
feel
fall
like
into
your
the
work
arty
does
party
that.
gallery. Whereas, yeah, the craft
The
thing,
corset scissors or the
yeah, some of them are. It does
knife.
depend on the project. Yeah.
True.
So, what do you consider art when you're making? Do you not consider some of your scissors pieces of art, or do you feel like they're? How do you make that divide, or do you even think
I
about
do
it?
make the divide, but I don't think it's necessarily apparent in the final piece.
Yeah.
So it is the starting point, the inspiration. So if there was a time when if I do design work, so I've got a brief, either it's a brief that I have invented, written myself, or it's come from outside, and there is a need that I am fulfilling, then that comes definitely under design for me. If it's a story that I'm wanting to illustrate, or a concept that I'm wanting to talk about, that comes under an art project for me. But if I've literally got a new piece of material or substance that I'm wanting to use, or I'm wanting to make the most of it, even the twisted seamstress scissors that I did, which were the corset based ones, the fact that the twist of the Damascus had to match the concept of the twist of the, that's really craft based as far as I'm concerned. There's because it was driven by the making the most of the twist in the Damascus.
Mm.
But whether people can see that as a final in the final piece, I don't know. And in a way, that's it doesn't matter, for instance, how many jewels or bits of gold is on it. As far as I'm concerned, that doesn't necessarily turn it into an art piece. It just turns it into a more expensive craft piece, potentially. Craft has a different feeling over in the States, I think, than it does over in the UK.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely sometimes here, or even in the industry that like we're in, someone adding more materials or more, fancy materials makes something more of an art knife, which isn't, to me, necessarily true. It doesn't make it a better piece, doesn't make it to me, a more desirable piece. And that's, I think, where I differentiate between some of the, other stuff out there.
Yeah, I would agree that you can have a beautifully ornate, incredibly elaborate piece, and it doesn't necessarily make it a piece of art.
Yeah, I think the definition that Tom is thinking of when he talks about craft versus art, it's not the same as what you're describing, Grace, right? I think they're a little bit different definitions. And like you said, that may be a difference, an American difference versus UK or European concept, like the difference in what that term means. But because I think when Tom thinks craftsperson, he's thinking the mechanical piece of it, right? He's thinking of the work that you do to get from the beginning to the end. Is that fair, Tom?
Yeah, 100%.
And the care that goes into it, and the consideration that goes into it, and the time, and the forward thinking that makes it all possible to get to an end result. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the same.
No, you see, I'm always surprised. I'm quite happy to call myself a craftsman, and say that I do crafts. But I feel that there's more of a stigma about it, like as though I'm just making paper doilies, or right. There's a whole load of very, Anyway, part of it though is because coming through academia from within the craft establishment, I think that we have a very different way of talking about craft, and a desire to reclaim the phrase craft and make it into something that is aspirational, as opposed to the corn dolly, paper doily brigade.
Right.
Right. When I think craftsman, I think like early 1900s, late 1800s furniture makers, the makers in Sheffield, that kind of thing. And that's where like to call myself a craftsperson too, because I think it's something to aspire to, and it's something to, it's that skill level.
Truth to materials. Yeah, I think it has a certain honesty to it that I like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So we talked about, so you grew up in the country on a farm, right? From at least from the time you came to the UK. Big shift for your father, right? Going from being an architect to being a farmer.
Yeah, he knew nothing. He didn't know how to lay hedges or farm sheep or do anything like that. It was a complete, yeah. He felt that it was a huge shift for all of us, for the entire family.
Yeah. Do you know why he did that?
Yeah, he'd come from England originally, qualified as an architect, moved to Australia. He was from a working class background in Liverpool, and realised that he wouldn't get anywhere in the UK because he hadn't been university trained as an architect. And then he was given his opportunity on Australia. And then when he was in his mid-40s, he realised that he was the partner in a very large architectural firm, not doing anything that he enjoyed doing. He was too busy managing the office to do any designing, and he'd just burnt out. And I guess that's part of the realization that I had, in that I didn't want to lose that love of my creativity, having seen that happen to him.
Right. That's exactly why it was same thing I thought when you said that he made this huge shift away from something to something else, maybe not understanding what he was getting into necessarily, right?
Yes, that's true. It's probably the same thing. I can blame him. It's probably his genes that made him uproot. At least I didn't have a family and small children to uproot when I moved to Sheffield.
Yeah, but it's a very similar thing, right? It's the same kind of idea as when you did your Sheffield move. So yeah, there you go. You have precedent for your decision at the time. But in some ways, I think sometimes unconsciously that can influence, right?
I think so. I think having the not being scared of that sort of thing,
exactly.
Of being able to say, it worked. I can make this work. I have confidence in my own ability to make whatever comes my way work for my advantage. So that's what I did. When I came up to Sheffield, I found out that Sheffield Hallam University was just starting a master's course in metalwork and jewellery. And I'd been working in Sheffield and looking around and realised that actually it would be cheaper for me to do a part-time master's course in the university and use all their equipment than it would be to set up my own workshop.
There you go.
Nice.
So that's what I did.
Sean's very familiar with that approach.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Sean's gone back to university to work on his associate's degree, and I think there's some of that in what Sean's been doing as well.
Oh, well, I'm completely institutionalized. I am still there. I'm still in the university now.
Yeah.
That is like my claim to fame. So I did that for part-time, and they were quite happy to let me do edged tools as my projects within the metalwork and jewellery department. So I was looking at knives and scissors and that sort of thing. And again, it wasn't really with the help of anybody within Sheffield, because there was still, I didn't feel as if there was anything very interesting or contemporary happening. It was still the old guys, and they weren't very kind of insular and difficult to break into. But the small engineering companies were always really happy to help, and the university obviously was always there. And then when I'd finished my MA, I accidentally had a baby halfway through my master's project, which delayed that. So I ended up doing 5 years. And I came out of that with a master's and a baby, and then got funding. This was so bizarre. I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to be doing after this. But I then I was helped to get funding to do a PhD.
Oh, nice.
So I ended up having a funded PhD looking at it was a practice-based PhD, making non-traditional Damascus steel in its role within custom knife making or something. It was,
Wow.
yeah, it was a lovely project apart from the fact that I had no metallurgy. So there you go. That's another example of me just throwing myself into a project and going, I have confidence I'll figure this out.
Oh, sure.
And yeah, I did. I loved it. I thought it was great.
Metallurgy on the fly.
Yeah, it was a very steep learning curve. Every time I'd go down to the metallurgy department and go, oh, my layers aren't sticking together, they'd go, they shouldn't be. Oh, okay, fine. So I was using, the investigation that I was doing was using solid state diffusion bonding, and I wanted to do steel and silver layers. So I got my billets to bond, that was fine. And then they would delaminate when I was hot rolling them for some bizarre reason. And I ended up developing a technique whereby I was encapsulating the silver layers in the steel. So there was, in fact, a steel weld around each edge of the billets that encapsulated the silver so I could put it through the hot rolling mill and they would stay together. Yeah, that was great. So I've ended up with pieces. My two questions that I needed to answer was, is it possible and is it worth it? Yeah. And yes, it's possible, and no, it's not worth it.
As is often the case, unfortunately. Yeah.
But I had a great time doing it. And yeah. And I still teach within the university, within the metalwork and jewellery department, particularly working with students. We now have a high percentage of female students, and we've discovered over the years that they get very intimidated by the machinery because they haven't had any craft teaching at schools.
Right.
So they come to us saying that they want to make metalwork and do jewellery, but how do they know that? Because they haven't even handled a piece of metal before. And they haven't, they've worn jewellery. That's it. Oh, wow. That's not a good basis for knowing this is something that you want, that's a vocation that you're wanting to do for even 3 years of a degree. So getting them down the workshop, helping them to use small lathes, even drill presses, stamping tools. Yeah, none of this is big. We don't have big forging equipment down there, but just getting them familiar with it and allowing them to not be intimidated by this. And that's kind of one of the things that I do, as well as teach design skills and sketchbook work. Sketchbooks are really important to me in my...
Do you find that the youth are becoming more receptive to metalwork lately than they have been in the past? Or has it stayed pretty constant?
Well, the demographic has certainly changed. I'm trying not to sound like an old fuddy-duddy now, but
yeah. When
they come in and they just want to render it in 3D on the computer and then assume that they can make it by, I don't know, pressing go on the computer and it'll be made with no understanding, even if it's just the most basic machining thing. So, that, for instance, decimal point being wrong, 2 places wrong in the speed or the feed rates. And, anybody who'd had any hands-on experience of a milling machine would know that that was an error.
Right.
They just don't see, or designing things that can't be milled out because they've not put the cutter radius on. They assume that they can get a square internal corner. Little things like that. They just want to go straight to doing. Well, no, it's not. It's a confidence thing again. They are intimidated by going down and getting their hands dirty and working with the machine and seeing how it does. They want to just be able to do a quick prototype, they've imagined it on Rhino or some sort of CAD package and they want it to happen.
Yeah.
And that disconnect with what is actually possible saddens me a little bit. I can understand it. And particularly, even as a university establishment, it's cheaper for us to buy them computers to render on than to have them down in the engineering department playing around and just seeing how things handle. Yeah.
Well, it seems like here there's been a pretty massive resurgence in people doing craft stuff, just in making, going back to the roots a little bit and making things. Even, with the coronavirus, stuff like that, more and more people are getting back into these things, these hand-built, handmade type of stuff. I don't know if that's something that's always kind of been around there, or if it's something that's becoming more popular.
I mean, absolutely. Here as well, apart from the fact that they are generally older people who are, have already had a career doing something else and have some life experience and desire to go back. And one of the things that I like most about scissor making, and particularly the way that I make scissors, because I'm not a manufacturer, it's easy to be intimidated by an industrial process and think, I can't do that. I couldn't make shoes by hand. They're made in a factory. I couldn't make knives. They're made in a factory. I can't make scissors. That I don't know where to start. But actually, the amount of tools, if you break it down, the amount of tools that you need is relatively small. And then you can just throw yourself into it and figure it out as you go along, because you need to know, you need to make mistakes, you need to have failures. And they're not going to be as good as you can buy to start with. That's absolutely so. But the information that you get by making those mistakes and playing, not only with materials, but with the processes, that's so valuable.
Yes.
And I think that also, as we have traditional crafts that die out, it doesn't matter how much we record them. The amount of information that those old craftspeople have, a lifetime's worth of experience, that they don't even consider valuable, because the last time they did it was in 1953, and now they still have it in their head, but if you asked them, they wouldn't remember that was of any importance until they have that problem crop up again, and bingo, they can remember that this worked last time and this will work again. Yeah, that if we let them all die out before we document and learn, it's really hard to get those skills back. Sorry, there endeth my lecture on heritage crafts.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's important. We need to recognize that.
It is.
Old tech can still be valuable tech. Old knowledge is still valuable knowledge.
Yeah, I have actually a direct example of that, and also the value of academic study, because it's often feels that it's separate to a craft practice. But so there are particular grinding machines that you need to use in scissor making to put the curve and the twist on the blades. And even when I was working, do I need to go back and talk about how I got into scissors?
I think either way is fine. We can definitely go back. I would say go ahead, because it's a great example of what you're talking about. Okay. So you have specific machines down, even in small artisan scissor makers now, that you used to put a curve and a twist on the inside of scissor blades. But even that is outside the scope of somebody like me working in my little workshop. So one of the things that I did was go back and try and find how scissors were made, how that twist and curve was put on prior to industrialization. And then, and through reading the texts that I was coming across, the description of the trades in Sheffield, I was able to find out how that was done previously and apply it to my practice now. And that means that I can do away with these kind of specialist machinery. And yeah, I think that's wonderful. And I think that, so you need the two. I think you need the research and you need the practice
knowledge, because if I had just been an academic looking at that text, I wouldn't have realized how profound it was. And if I was just a person working in my own workshop without the access to that information, to those historical documents, I would have had to have figured it out myself.
Right. When I went to engineering school, it was very, the program I was in was a cooperative program where we would go to school and then go to work and go to school and work and rotate through every 3 months. And so you get a piece of that exposure to hands-on through laboratory work, right? We did powdered metal and machining, and forging. And so those things were part of the groundwork to help us get an idea, if we were actually paying attention, that, like you said, you can come up with an idea, but you have to actually be able to produce it somehow. And those hands-on experiences gave you they gave you those guardrails around, what can you do and what can't you do, and what does it take to make that part happen? And, you have to incorporate all those things into a complex design. But the work part was really key for me because, and I've talked about this on the show before, where, I would come up with a prototype part that I needed for a project that I was working on, a development project for a future program. And, I would take it to our machine shop, and I was familiar with the way most of the machines worked and stuff, but I would take this design to the machine shop, and a couple days later I would get a call, and I would come to the machine shop and get summarily berated for drawing something that they couldn't make, right? They didn't have the ability to make. And a few of those experiences, the guys were very helpful in the same way that you're talking about the older craftspeople in Sheffield. They were very helpful because they say, kind of grab me by the ear and say, all right, come here, I'm going to show you what I'm talking about, and take me to the machine and, say, okay, look, you know how this machine works. Here's the drawing you gave us. Here's why I can't do what you want me to do. And, a lot of the approaches that people took were, okay, great, I'll go back and work on changing it. And I found huge value in mining that experience to stand there with the expert, right? The person who makes things like this for a living, and having the conversation in the context of the project itself, right? Like, okay, how would you approach this, right? Is there a way that you can see that this could work? And they all become those little memory bank entries, like the 1953 example you gave about earlier, right? Where they all kind of start to fit in your brain after a while. And it's like, oh, okay, these pieces all help me make something better next time I come up with an idea, right? Or if I come up with a design that needs to happen. And in the absence of those kind of experiences, there's kind of a weird catch-22, right? In the absence of those experiences, it's very easy to make designs that you can't produce. At the same time, like we've talked about here before, there's some beauty in the innocence of not knowing that you can't make it, right?
Yeah.
You can come up with design features or concepts, or you're not constrained by the same guardrails. So yeah, you might come up with something that you couldn't actually make, but at the same time, maybe you explored a corner of the box that someone who is too familiar with the guardrails would never even think to go to.
I think, though, with the ease of 3D modeling and stuff like that, it's easier to get that disconnect of, look how easy it is to draw this and do that, and be like, that you're not taking into account how you can fixture it, hold it, do things needed and necessary to make those parts interact. And that, I think that's where we can get very distant from each other.
Yeah, I think certainly when I see the inexperienced designers working, I think it's much easier to get a jarring curve or a jarring resolution on a computer if you're inexperienced. Whereas if you've drawn it by hand and the curve doesn't feel nice when you're drawing it, when your pencil goes over the line, then it's not going to feel nice in your hand when it's done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think that's where things like 3D printing and some of these very new manufacturing technologies are going to turn a bunch of these things upside down as they start to become more mature, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can make features and shapes and maybe things that are organically comfortable that would be either incredibly painful or impossible to machine or, create through a stock removal process. So, okay, so you went all the way through, got a PhD.
Yes.
And where did you go from there? And we can make our way to the scissor piece of it, and maybe that's what comes next. But
Yes, because actually, up until the end of my PhD, I was working that was 2003, 2004, I think I finished my PhD. And really, although I was aware of the wider knife making industry and custom contemporary knife making industry, and certainly stuff that was happening in the States and that sort of thing, I was still working very much within the limited scope of Sheffield and the UK, and didn't have much contact outside that from the knife making and the knife making aesthetic point of view. And at the end of my PhD, I had this material. I think, no, it wasn't the end. It was coming to the end. I had pieces of material that had laminated, but I hadn't actually got anything made from them at the time. And I started reaching out to Damascus makers to see whether they could give me any feedback, kind of help about where I might go and that sort of thing. Still within my doctorate, I hadn't finished at this stage. I was struggling with various bits, making them work. So I decided that I'd see what other experience and expertise there was out there. And I reached out, and one of the people who responded was Ed Shemp.
okay.
And he said that it was far too complicated to talk about by email, but he was going to be at the Paris Knife Show, and that was going to be in autumn, and it must have been summer when I was talking to him, so it was only a month or so away. He'd be there. If I came over, he would be quite happy to talk to me about it, and signed himself off, and that was fine. So I decided that I'd go to the show, and that was the first proper knife show that I'd been to. So that was the first contact that I'd had where I'd actually gone and seen other knife makers exhibiting their work. And I was a little bit scared, a little bit nervous about going and approaching this strange man who had already by that stage built up quite a range of interesting Damascus kind of skills. So I had also spoken to Daryl Mayer. It's great, isn't it? I just decided to email him, and years later he kind of went, "Oh yeah, we met years later," and he went, "Yeah, I remember your email." It was kind of like, yeah the arrogance of youth. So I went to the knife show, and I was looking around, and there were all these kind of men sitting behind their tables with all the amazing knives in front of them. And there was this one guy sitting there with sellotape holding his glasses together. And I just thought, there is no way I can be intimidated with a man who is sitting there with his glasses held together with sellotape. And that was Ed. And that was the start of a wonderful friendship. And he's been so good. He was my first, feeder. And the introductions that he's made, and the support and the encouragement over the years has just been invaluable. And the links that he's given me, so he's been, oh, you should go and see this person, or tell him that I've sent you, or, that sort of thing. Wonderful. Couldn't have asked for a better person to have started into the industry with. And he has absolutely no... he's just so humble and so willing to share his information, and so gleeful about my successes. But yeah, it's lovely. Yeah.
That's great. So you went to the Paris show. That's kind of a big first show. I've never been to the Paris show. I don't know, Michael or Tom or Sean, have you guys ever been there?
I want to go so badly one year.
I haven't.
So at least by the pictures or the photos that we've seen online, Grace, there's some pretty fascinating work at the Paris show. So a big show to be your first, right?
Yes. Yeah, it was. But then my next show was Blade Show.
There you go.
So because I wanted to come across and to present the work that I was doing, because I realized that unless I put out what it was that I was trying to do, people wouldn't be able to give me feedback on it. And that was really important to me, and making those connections was really important. So that was 2003, because I was pregnant at the time and I'd planned my baby. Okay, so I'd got funding to do my PhD, and I realized in the small print that they would pay maternity leave.
Ah, okay.
And I could not imagine another situation where I would ever get paid maternity leave. So I said to my husband, my partner, we weren't married at the time, I said to him, okay, if we want another baby, this is the time. And you basically have a 1 month window of opportunity.
Oh, wow.
Right? Because I don't want to be too fat to fly to Atlanta. And I have to take my year of absence in October.
Ah, yeah.
No pressure.
No pressure. But if you want a second child, now's the time. I kind of ruined all the joy, apparently. Nothing like working to a deadline on this one.
We're on the clock. We're on the clock, pal. Let's get going.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I have 2 children, and Alara was born in November, so perfect timing, really.
Wow.
And I've been going to Blade Show. No, I think I missed the next one because I was obviously young baby. But then from 2005, I've been to every Blade Show since then. And that's been really, really important. To do those 2 a year, to do Blade Show and to do the Paris show, have been kind of keystones in my year, so that I can plan my work around what I'm wanting to do for those.
Yeah.
Because you see, I've missed a whole segment out now because my parents moved up. My mother had MS, and I decided that as my maternity project, so if I was going to be paid to take a year out, I might as well make it count.
Yep.
So I decided that I was going to renovate the house next door to us so that my parents could move up. So actually, I gave birth. You don't need to include this, but I gave birth on the Sunday, and then on the Monday we had concrete delivery due. So my husband's a doctor, and I made him sign me out of the maternity ward on the Monday morning at 10 o'clock so that I could be there for the concrete delivery at midday. In hindsight, it's just ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I finished my PhD with a 5-year-old, a baby in arms, a disabled mother, and a father who'd just had a stroke.
Oh, geez.
And you just don't realize it's just a way of working. You just need to have discipline. Sorry, all those people who think that's terrible, but you need to compartmentalize the time that you've got and make it really count.
Yeah.
And then after my PhD, I was doing my own work and I was caring for my mother. And I could get carers to come in and sit with her for 2-hour blocks, 3 days a week. And those 2-hour blocks, I would go down to the workshop. Because I had my workshop at that stage. It's lovely. It's a converted public toilet. So that was another job to do. It's tiny and it's only 10 minutes walk away. It's not far away, but it was separate to the rest of the house. But it meant that when I went down to the workshop, I would actually have to be making. I couldn't be sitting around twiddling my thumbs, wondering what I was going to be doing. And that meant that my sketchbook discipline is really strong because I could stay looking after her and being available to the children and be cooking or kind of doing other things, being domestic and be sketching and really developing the ideas that I had, so that when I went, the idea of going into the workshop with a piece of metal and just letting the steel decide what it's going to be is a complete anathema as far as I'm concerned. There's no way I could work like that. When I go down to the workshop, all I'm trying to do is get a manifestation of the image that I have in my head, that I have in the sketchbook, to try and get as close to that as possible.
Right.
So it's already fully realized. It's all the details are worked out. Everything down to the finest, detail is already there in my head and my sketchbook. And then it's a matter of going and trying to figure out how I'm going to do that in the workshop.
I really like your workshop. It's got a lot of history to it. I love the pictures of it. You know, to me, I'm sort of envious of seeing what you see out your window and the walls, the history in it. And, you know, mine is basically modern sheetrock and things like that are just, it feels more manufactured, more, I don't know. It's hard to draw inspiration from it. And when I see pictures of your shop, it's very inspirational to me.
The whole being in Sheffield actually is really important to me because, I mean, we have the illusion now that Sheffield knife making is dead, but in fact, we produce more blades in Sheffield now than we ever have done in the history of Sheffield.
Really?
Absolutely. But it's business to business. So it's things like meat processing blades and that sort of thing. And it's, there are fewer people working in the knife making industry. So for instance, we have Swan Morton, who are scalpel blade makers, and they produce millions of blades. But of course, it's all automated. So, you know, you don't have, but even so, even with the fewer people working in the industry, there is still the history around. So there's still the small manufacturing companies that are willing to help me because they're used to doing small things. And there are people tap on my window as they pass by and lift their children up so that they can see me working at my workbench. And they tap on the door and they say, yeah, my aunt Mabel, she was a buffer girl, and we've still got some of the old cutlery canteen in the attic and that sort of thing. And people still have that tradition. And even the idea of me being a female working in the cutlery industry is a continuation of all the hundreds of thousands of women who were doing that over the years and managing small babies and, you know, trying to fit it into their domestic family life. And, you know, in fact, in Sheffield, we have, there's still evidence in some of the terraced houses in the kitchens of holes in the kitchen floor where women would have put a small anvil, post anvil, and they would have been doing piecework in the kitchen whilst doing their domestic work.
That's amazing. And that was actually one of my questions I had earlier was the town Sheffield aware of its own very long and rich history?
Yes.
And is there a way you can kind of tell our listeners a little bit more? 'Cause I'm sure most folks have heard the name Sheffield, but they may not understand how far back it goes.
Sheffield has amazing kind of geography where we have streams. We have 5 rivers coming into the valley. We also have sandstone and gritstone, and we have iron ore. And that meant that really early on, it became a centre of processing iron. And in fact, I was climbing on the weekend on Stanwich Edge, and even at the bottom, which is a rock formation, any climbers will know Stanwich Edge. It's the most amazing kind of grit face that you can climb up and boulder up, and it's all kind of trad climbing. But at the bottom, there are these dozens of old grindstones that you can see that must have been cut out of the gritstone and then just abandoned. They were just not thought worth rolling down the hill.
Wow.
And they're just sitting there. So, you know, that resource of the old grindstones was there, and kind of the water was here for powering. Became more and more industrialized through the Victorian time, and a lot of the housing is Victorian because, of course, the wealth was there then. So industrialists were building houses for workers and then factories for them. They're now being repurposed for other things, but it's still there. And very, if you know what you're looking for, you know, there's evidence all over the city. The whole city it's very green, but it's green because the Victorian industrialists planted trees and planted and protected their river resources so that they could use them for powering machinery.
Wow. I really want to visit Sheffield now. And I was looking up some of the history, and I found like the first reference to Sheffield was like back to 1297. And that's amazingly long history.
Yeah. We have little byproducts of the steel industry as well. So I was given a whole load of figs that were Sheffield grown. The most amazing, huge figs. Figs! I can hear you say figs in England. This is Mediterranean.
Right.
Why are these growing in Sheffield? And why is this specific to Sheffield? Okay. Well, start off, our rivers were not considered particularly healthy, so effluent would have gone into the rivers. Okay, we're happy with that. They would have had fig seeds in them from quite early on, but also all the forges would have been discharging warm water into the rivers to the point where the river temperatures rose and fig trees grow wild along the banks of the river.
Oh, wow.
So now the rivers are beautifully clean. We've got fish in them and, the wonderful kind of channels for wildlife. But there are these mature fig trees that started there, growing wild in the Victorian time because of the heat coming into the rivers from the industrial plants and, the effluent running in.
Wow. Crazy to think about.
I know. And, you can just pass through things. You don't need to know all this stuff. But the more you learn, the more kind of interwoven all this history is into the landscape of the city.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, that's really cool. I think...
You're going to have to do so much editing here.
No, those are all fantastic. I'm leaving all that in.
That's gold.
I think that's a very interesting consideration. And, the U.S. is so young, relatively speaking, compared to anywhere in Europe, that it doesn't seem like we would have as much of that kind of history. And it certainly doesn't go as far back, obviously, but we do have some of the same kinds of things where, like I live near Detroit, and there are things about the Detroit area that are common to the Detroit area that are part of the culture here that by no means came from here, right? Like figs in Sheffield, right? They didn't come from Sheffield. They came to Sheffield and flourished there, at least at some level, right? And so in Detroit, we have much of the same thing, right? There's a great deal of Greek culture in Detroit. There's some Southern U.S. culture that came here during the 60s that remains here. There are a huge community of Polish people that immigrated here and worked in industry here. And as a result, there's a huge part of the food culture around Detroit that comes from the Polish community here. And so it's kind of this melting pot thing that I think happened in many places at varying levels, obviously. But it takes someone to stop and think for a few minutes about how did this happen this way, right? Why do small corner restaurants around where I live, we call them a coney, like a Coney Island, but they're almost all, yes, there's typically American food, but there's always Greek food on the menu. And that's because all of those restaurants were started by Greek immigrants that came to the U.S. and the Greek food just became part of the culture. And but a lot of people don't even think about that, right? It's like, oh, let's go to the Coney because we always get a gyro there, or we get this certain kind of food there, or whatever. And it's pretty cool if you stop and spend the time to think about it.
It does seem sad, though, that you have to reach almost a stage of losing it before people even start seeing the value of it.
Yeah.
And I think this is why, talking to people, from America, and they kind of go, wow, why wasn't this saved, this factory or what have you? No, well, we didn't see any value in it, so we just bulldozed it and threw all the kind of the knife blanks in the skip. Who would want those, really?
Right.
And in fact, they've dredged the River Don a while ago and found that out the back of a lot of the factories, there's a huge amount of steel in the river, and that's because if workers didn't do a particularly good job, they'd just lob them out the window into the river.
Right.
So there were all these knives sitting in the bottom of the river because they're half finished or they didn't work out quite right or, whatever. And they'd just get lobbed in the river.
Yeah. Crazy.
It'll be a joy for an archaeologist at some time in the future.
Yes.
You guys don't just throw them out the window?
Mine are just on the floor. That's
Everybody has the bucket of rejects. We just had a river outside, that you'd lob it into.
Nice.
I was going to say, Jeremy Marsh throws his at his shop garage door.
mm-hmm.
So there's
I've got a box of shame.
box of shame. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think at Michael's place when I was down, we were looking at one of the many toolboxes in his shop, and you open a drawer, and it's like, this is the drawer of broken dreams, right? These are projects gone wrong that couldn't bear to throw away, right? Like,
I like to
maybe it's savable.
remind myself of my rejection. I like to know that I messed up poorly on a lot of things.
Right.
It's good for my mental health.
Yeah.
Grace brings up a good point, though. You have that hillside out back that goes down to a creek. If you threw it hard enough, you might make it all the way.
Unfortunately,
true.
there are children in the way of mine. Otherwise, I would. my workshop backs out onto a school playing ground. So I think that if I started throwing my rejects out the window, I might get complaints from the school.
Somebody's got to stop the crazy lady in the toilet over there throwing knives at the children.
Well, when I was converting it, I had a little note put through the door saying, "Please be a sweet shop," and it must have come from one of the children at the school. No, sorry, not a sweet shop.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's an outlet for all of your baking projects.
Yeah, that's true.
Put those in the window when people come by. So, okay. Sheffield, we got a little piece of that history. We'd like to come back and talk to you about that sometime in much more detail.
Very much.
We talked about your shop that you built or converted.
Mm-hmm.
How did the scissor thing fit in? Because I think that's the way a lot of people will recognize your name and your work is through scissors.
Scissors. Well, I was happily making folding knives. I say happily. I was kind of bumbling along making folding knives. And then I decided that if I was going to make folding knives, then I'd quite like to make scissors to go in them. So I started looking at scissors, and I made one knife with a pair of scissors in it. And I realised that although they worked all right, if they hadn't have worked, I wouldn't have known why they didn't work or how to have put them right.
You realized you got lucky?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And at the time, I also heard about a little firm in Sheffield called Ernest Wright that were making scissors. So I did a little bit of investigation and found out that they were coming to their end. They were owned by the grandson of the original Ernest Wright, and they'd had financial difficulties, and really they were just trying to keep on long enough for the three old guys to retire, that they were all 60. Actually, one was close to 70, and they wouldn't have been able to find any other employment. So, they were just keeping on going. And I went down and persuaded them to teach me how to make scissors. And that was basically it. I only wanted to make the little ones that went into folding knives. But they said that that I really needed to know, I really needed to start on medium-sized scissors for a start, before I started applying them to little ones and big ones, so that I could learn why all the subtleties that go on into scissors. And it was practically instantaneous. I realized that scissors have the same joy for me that I was looking for in a folding knife, in that it's really, you can get quite quickly from your raw material to a folding knife that works all right. But then you can spend 10 times that amount of time getting it into something that works really beautifully, that makes you smile when you open and shut it.
Right.
And it's the same with scissors. You can get adequate scissors relatively quickly, but then all the subtlety that goes on in scissors can just, it feels like I've fallen down a rabbit hole, and under the surface there is this rabbit warren of information and subtlety and minutiae, and yeah, it's just glorious. I can feel it. It's all absorbing. And one of the first things I learned was that I went down there assuming that scissors were two knives joined together with a screw. And I think that a lot of knife makers think that when they first look at scissors, and they're not. They are actually springs, not knives, and that their cutting action is really different. And then just looking at it's so difficult to retro-engineer a pair of scissors because of the subtlety that goes on inside them. There are all sorts of ways that, and also it's not only European scissors, because that's all that I was looking at. How were scissors made in Sheffield? And then as soon as you start looking at how scissors were made on mainland Europe, how scissors were made in the Far East, and then looking at things like Middle Eastern scissors, and there's just thinking about the history of things. There is so much source material there, and it is really, really poorly documented. The amount of information that is out there on knife making is vast in comparison to scissor making, and they're not comparable. There's lots of crossovers, absolutely, but there's a huge amount of stuff that is specific to scissor making. And really, really my role, because I'm not a manufacturer, I don't produce. Once I've made a pair of scissors, I've lost interest. I want to go on to the next pair. I don't want to make a run of them.
Right.
Yeah, they is to make people enthusiastic about them as tools, and start giving people the information that I'd love more people to make scissors. If anybody wants to make scissors and they want to have a go, get in contact with me, because my information is there for sharing. There's no point in me hoarding it for myself. I'm not going to be able to use it in my lifetime. The more people that I have that start looking at scissors and how they work, and it's an everyday tool. And I've accidentally fallen into something that I'm really passionate about, and also works particularly well within the UK, because of course even pocket knives, if I told people that I was a knife maker, they would automatically picture a weapon. And certainly in the UK, there's a stigma attached to knives. The new knife makers that are coming through are almost all kitchen knife makers now. And that is because that artisan kitchen knife is accessible to the general public.
Without the stigma.
Hunting knives are really difficult at the moment to you've got an uphill battle as far as public perception goes. But scissors, nobody questions scissors. Scissors are like an everyday tool that get overlooked. And they're wonderful.
Very cool. So when you say that you were working on scissors that went in folding knives, the folding knives you were making were like a back spring, traditional pocket knife kind of thing. And the scissors that you were trying to make at the time, they were like what we think of as like a Swiss Army knife pair of scissors that fold into the handle. Yeah. Okay.
And I have made I did a pair of scissors a couple of years ago, which were based on an old Victorian design for cigar scissors. And they were lovely. I'd come across them, and they were like a multi-tool. So they cut the ends off cigars. I'm not a cigar smoker. And they had a prick, and they had a match striker, and then they had various other things. I can't remember what they were. And then they also had a folding blade that folded onto the blade of the pair of scissors. And this felt like it was a complete circle for me, that I had originally wanted to make scissors that went into a folding knife, and now finally I had made a folding knife that went onto a pair of scissors.
Right. Oh, that's really cool. I saw that picture on your Instagram when I was scrolling, and I'm like, what? I think it was a drawing of it. I'm like, wait a second, what is that? It took me a minute to kind of figure out exactly what it was, but that is
and it was based on a design, Victorian design.
So this is a really good time to ask Grace, because I know you made a recent post about this. The difference between scissors, shears, and snips, just for people to help set what exactly you mean when you say scissors, because I think people would assume those three are the same. Most people.
Yes, that's contentious, and it does depend who you talk to.
Oh, great! Now we're going to lose all our scissor listeners.
I know.
Thanks, Grace.
Snips are generally designed to do single cuts. So they're thread snips, maybe. So you just use them the once. Often sprung, so that they tend to be smaller and they open themselves. You don't have to have finger loops to pull them back open.
Okay.
So that's snips. They are relatively straightforward. Scissors and shears. Now, some people think that that's based on size, and that's partially true. Generally, it's also, if you look back over documents, it can also be whether it's professional or domestic. And I use that advisedly rather than, because it starts getting gendered at this stage, because domestic is more female and traditionally the professional would be male. So there's this is a grey area, but dressmakers generally use scissors, tailors use shears, and they might both be 12-inch scissors, 12-inch shears, but the fact that a man uses them in a tailor's shop makes them shears, and a woman uses them in the house makes them scissors.
Interesting.
So there is and it's a problem. One of my COVID projects was translating a book on the history of scissors from German to English, and this is part of the issue with the fact that there's so little documentation, that I've got all the books I know, all the books I can find in English on scissors and scissor making. And I'm now having to go further afield and really challenge my language skills. My mother was German, but that's no excuse to thinking that I could just translate a book from German into English. And it has been a challenge, and I've loved every minute of it, and I've finished it now. And it is just for my own information, but the Germans don't make a difference between shears and scissors.
Okay.
And even on the old, so that requires, as an English speaker, me to have context so that I can then decide, are these shears that they're talking about, or are these scissors that they're talking about? Because, an English speaker knows which is which.
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. So the scissors that you are building into folding knives, by those definitions, would really be snips.
Yes.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
So when it comes to your designs with the scissors, do you go mainly traditional? Like, do you look up, pieces that have done in the past and kind of do you version them, or are you creating your own altogether? Which path do you usually go with your scissors?
Both.
Both.
But at the moment, they are historical examples of scissors that I'm using as a starting point, and that I will make a modern interpretation of those.
Yeah.
There are times when I will be drawing inspiration from not necessarily scissors, but architecture or patterns in nature and that sort of thing, particularly for the handles and the bows and that sort of thing. Maybe the more decorative elements of some of them. But the starting point is almost always at the moment taking a historical example and trying to understand it better. And I do full-size model making as well. I make wooden models so that I can see how things are handling in 3D before I start working them. And I've got a batch of desk scissors coming through at the moment because I work 2 years ahead of myself. I know what I'll be doing in 2 years' time.
Wow.
So I already know what my blade show table will be like for next year. And I have a pretty good idea about what it's going to be for the year after. Because I have so many ideas that I'm wanting to do, and I don't make that much. So that they have to wait in patient line. Sometimes they get a bit impatient and they kind of nudge each other, that's actually the only time that I take on commissions is if somebody kind of comes to me with an idea and it fits into something that I've already got in the back of my mind that I've already started thinking about, and I'll think, oh well, I'll bring that forward. That will jump the queue a little bit, and I'll bring that forward. But so I plan years in advance, and I know that next year on my blade show table, I'm going to have a whole load of stuff that's been inspired by Middle Eastern calligraphy scissors. And they have a very different feel to them. The bows aren't side by side, they're nesting inside one another, in front of one another. So they're much slimmer shape. And that's, we assume, because we only have in our kind of culture, we have these 2 finger bows side by side, and that's the shape of the scissors that we're used to, and we assume that that's the only shape that's possible, but we forget that scissors are a learnt skill. And in fact, if you talk to any primary school teacher, they'll tell you just how much time they spend teaching children to learn to use scissors and to learn to use this type of scissor, and it's not the only scissor that's possible. So by looking at another culture's way of cutting, it means that I can start challenging how people see scissors and, interpret them in a more modern way.
I like that. Now, when you reference the bows, is that the finger holes that you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So you have the finger bows are the bows are where you put your fingers. The shanks are what would join those onto the blades of the scissors.
Okay, thank you.
And that's Sheffield terminology. So, if there are other, and then again, we have a problem with translation. So, how that's translated. If the Germans obviously have slightly different, I think they call them, the direct translation of the German is eyes rather than bows. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. What, so when you say calligraphy scissors, I've seen the pictures on your Instagram, I think, showing some of the concepts and some of the wood models that you've made toward those, if I'm understanding which ones, right? Where instead of the bows being next to each other, they're one before the other and they nest inside. So what is a calligraphy scissor for? That's a pretty specific design.
Okay. There's a particularly rich thread of scissors from the Middle East around that time that is much richer than the European scissor of that time. And the reason for that is that in the 1700s, 1800s in Europe, the scribes would have been mainly in the employment of the church. So they would have had relatively utilitarian tools. However, in the Muslim countries where representational art was limited, calligraphy took on its own art form. So scribes were encouraged to have ornate tools and high quality tools, and they would have had mentors and the people who they would have been very wealthy sponsors, and they would have expected their scribes to have had tools that were suitable for their status. And you can get historical examples of calligraphy rolls where you have almost like surgeon's rolls, field rolls, where you'd have all these tools in a really neat bundle. You'd have these long scissors, you'd have brushes, you'd have scrapers and little long inkwells as well. And some of these are absolutely beautiful. I mean, they are extraordinarily beautiful, but they were all quite compact and very kind of discreet. And the scissors fit into that whole aesthetic of being, almost traveling scissors. And they'd have been used for cutting the edges of paper, decaling them and making slightly decorative motifs.
Okay.
And is that the reason for the slimmer design, was to fit in the roll?
Yes.
Is that, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they were used differently so that they were used in the air. So they were never designed to be used on the table as kind of like dressmaking scissors would rest on a workbench. These were very much similar to hairdressing scissors these days. They're used in the air to cut pieces of paper.
Okay.
And they're lighter. They have a very hollow grind to the blades, and the whole, they have a delicacy that we weren't seeing in European scissors of a comparable period.
Now, are we looking for these is this going to be a Blade 2021
Yes.
thing that you, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I look forward to seeing those.
And they're out of Damascus. And this is another joy for me. I've discovered EDM wire cutting, and this gives me the ability to do cutting. And that one of the problems with scissors is that they're very wasteful if you're doing them as stock removal. And I'm fundamentally a stock removalist. This comes back to the engineering side of things. I'm not a forger. I'll just about make my own Damascus if I need to, but as soon as it's a material for me to use, I'm then happy with my tools. And I file a lot. I don't even grind. I apologize to all the grinders out there, but no, I file everything still. I have I think it's a working grinder upstairs, but in my workshop, but actually it's just a really expensive cobweb catcher.
It's a spider sanctuary. Grace.
It's my shame. It is my shame. Any real knife maker who comes to my workshop looks at it and goes, why is it not working? Why have you got? Well, I think it might be working. I think I know how to switch it on. I use files, but I'm not. It's not that I'm shy of technology. Using something like EDM wire cutting allows me to do things that I just could not do in any other way. And I'm the only. I think it's fair to say that I'm the only scissor maker who has ever use this technology to make scissors. And I'm pretty convinced about that because nobody else would feel the need to.
Right.
And part of that is that it means that I can get pattern matching working across my scissors so that when my scissors are shut, the pattern of the Damascus flows from one to the other. And it's a perfect match. Whereas if I'd had to take them out of two different bits of Damascus, there's every chance that they wouldn't match up. And then also what I do is not only do I cut the profile out, but I also cut down the blade so that sideways on the patterns match as well.
Oh, wow.
Nobody knows these things. Nobody sees these things apart from me, but they give me so much pleasure.
Yeah. I think it's
I'll start talking about that. As soon as I start making them, I'll start talking about that in my Instagram feed because I think that is it. Yeah, people are interested in it, and it's a little bit geeky. And there's going to be a whole load of people who go, "I don't get it. I don't understand why it's necessary." And then there's going to be people who go, "Absolutely, that makes sense to me too."
Yeah.
But I'll take stuff get it EDM'd or do other things to it, and then I'll sit there and file it. And that hand working is still really important to me. It's an odd mix of machining and handwork.
I was just going to say it's a fascinating blend of, sort of very cutting edge is a terrible pun, but very current technology, right? Taking advantage of very, very current technology for useful reasons, combined with, what I would think of, and this may not be fair, but as an even more craft or base process like filing rather than using a grinder.
Mm. Yes. And part of it is joy. We go back to me being self-indulgent in that it gives me pleasure to file and to do the handwork in a way that kitting up, putting on a respirator, all the safety kit, standing at a grinder for hours on end, it just doesn't do it for me.
Do you think that, Grace, is because of the side of it that is kind of like the honoring tradition side of it, or is it more the kind of tune everything out and, you know what I mean, let this just be what you're doing, you know what I mean, and pushing everything else out of your brain, or some combination of the two?
It's not a kind of a worthy thing about it being historical or anything like that. I think part of it is that I do the process that I need to do to get the results that I want. And if I had the skills to grind it, I probably would grind it. I do have the skills to file it, so I file it. And I get a precision with my filing that I wouldn't be able to get with my grinding. That's not to say that other people couldn't. And I've seen people make a right mess of filing, and I'm just horrified by their ability to massacre a piece of steel with a file. And I probably my designs are probably designed for my own skill set.
Sure.
So if other people took them on and tried to make them, I'd actually be quite intrigued what techniques they would use. I got an email. I got the kind of compulsory email from somebody, Instagram message, saying that they'd seen my work on Instagram, and would I like to have them made cheaper in India? They could make thousands of them.
Right.
If I sent them the designs. And there are times when I'm quite tempted to go, if you think you can do it, feel free, because it would save me an awful lot of effort if you think you can do them, because I'm not convinced that I'm pretty sure that I design specifically to suit my way of doing things.
Sure. Now that would make sense.
The only thing I can think of is someone possibly using burrs and, Fordham type stuff. But even that,
I do that sometimes. Yeah.
Sometimes it's easy to make a very fast mistake. Even when I'm grinding, I like to grind slow and stuff because I like to see the mistake coming.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And we go back to the doing this by hand. So, when I'm drawing, I draw by hand. I might put it on the computer later, but that drawing by hand and the shapes that my arm makes, and I generally do stuff full size, working on A4 quadrille paper, and if the curve is nice on the paper, and if I'll draw it a few times, and if it jars each time, then I know that there's something wrong. And then when I've drawn it out and I've put it on and I've made it, then as I'm filing it, it's the same scale, it's the same shape that my hand is making as I'm filing it. And it's nice and it's easy. And then that means that hopefully, if everything works out all right, the final piece looks as effortless and as easy as I would hope it would do. Because it's my hand drawing, it's my hand filing, it's now my hand handling the final piece. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We've talked about stuff like that before, where, especially on the design side, where, one of the questions we often ask makers, especially those who use CNC equipment or otherwise, is do you design on paper or do you design on the computer? And that's a very common theme that many makers like to draw by hand rather than go directly to doing it on the screen because of those shapes that come out of your hand, like you said, are familiar, right? They're comfortable shapes. And we've certainly had examples of both, right? Some people really prefer to draw on the computer, but I think the majority, the guys can tell me if I'm getting this wrong, the majority seem to enjoy the the design process piece of it, even if they're going to use a piece of equipment like an EDM or a CNC machine to get a shape started, they like that hand feel in the design. Organic
curves. I like everything to flow.
Yeah, it's interesting because very often my final pieces, people look at them and then go, oh, they're really kind of female looking shapes. And it's not necessarily something that I'm doing consciously, but I think there's something about curves.
Right.
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
That often end up looking very feminine and really comfortable. And yeah, I'm always fascinated by the idea whether my gender is apparent in the pieces of work that I do. Whether anybody would ever look at my scissors and not know that I was a female, because it's not something that I think about when I'm designing. They're just scissors; they just happen. But I do wonder.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Something to think about. I think, many of the shapes I think do, to me, have a feminine feel to them, obviously, but some of them are not, right? Some of them, like the Mokame handled scissors and some other ones that are much blockier, or blockier is the wrong word. I'm trying to think
more geometric.
More geometric. There you go. Not as much, maybe, right? And maybe that's not fair, but that's what they just don't seem as flowy, right? So many of your pieces, and that's, I think, like in Michael's work, his designs tend to be very organic and what I would call flowy. And I think of your scissors as much the same way, where they're, like you said, shapes from nature, or maybe shapes from history that kind of got turned in a slightly different direction, or otherwise, but they have, like you said, great curves. And I think that is part of what the appeal is, at least to me. Sean, did you want to ask a question about...
Yeah, I have a bit of a technical question. You mentioned doing scissors with a hollow ground edge, and I'm pretty sure all the scissors I've ever used have had a flat grind on them. Why would you use a hollow grind versus a flat grind, and what determines which grind you're going to use?
Available technology, I think, is the easiest thing to say. When you look at the inside of scissors, you only want the very cutting edge to touch, and everything back from that you want as clearance. And on a blacksmith made pair of scissors, you might actually put in a physical twist where you lift up the cutting edge and you drop away the back edge. And in that case, it would be that edge, that face would be flat, pretty much flat. As soon as you start working on stones, you start getting you can remove the clearance from the cutting edge, and you start getting a little bit of a hollow. On the Middle Eastern scissors, they've used a tiny wheel, maybe 3-inch, something like that, and some of them are incredibly pronounced, so that they almost look like sections taken from a tube. And what that means is that you can get a rigid cutting blade that is incredibly light, because it's almost like a section of a tube. It's difficult to explain without drawings, but if you look at some of the calligraphy scissors, you can see that there's a very definite hollow running down the blade, and then on the outside it will also be curved to match it, so that you have this maybe 2 mil wall thickness that is the blade.
So it's almost like an airfoil shape. It's hollow curved on both sides. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah. So
very interesting.
One of the things that it may be worth noting, I think, I, having been to Michael's shop before, we've sat and had a beer and looked through his sketchbooks over time to think about designs and talk about some stuff that he's done in the past and how that influences what he's doing in the future. But I think in Michael's sketchbooks, they're really purely sketch, right? Is that fair, Michael? There's not a lot of technical notes in there. They're more
it's
shape exploration.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. There'll be a line or a curve that I find interesting, or something I saw in a building or something, or just disproportionate type blades and handles, because I find how it flows together looks good, which may not work practically into a built knife. But yeah, shape exploration is a good way of putting it.
And so obviously there are the same kinds of things in your sketchbook work, Grace, but it looks like, at least again from the photos, that your sketchbook is also very much a planning tool. Is that?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's everything there from the original source material, because I think it's really important to be able to, in academia, we would never think of putting a quote and not track back the original source. So if I take an image and use it as inspiration, I want to know where I got it from. I want to know who originally made it and its provenance, so that I've got it there. And I don't have a particularly good memory. So if I don't document it in my sketchbook, then I lose it. So I'll start off with inspiration, and then loose sketches, and then tightening up sketches. And then as the project starts developing, and I might be doing full-size models, and I might be making notes about modifications and details that I'm working out, and then right down to lists of bits of materials that I need to get, or process procedure. So which order I'm thinking of machining it in order to be able to do what I'm doing and still be able to hold, like normal workshop stuff. But it helps me to remember, but it also helps to document it, because, as I say, I'm not always working on consecutive days. So even now I might be doing a couple of days, and then I'll have a break away from the workshop for a week, and then then I'll have to go back down. So being able to make notes in my sketchbook about what I was doing when I left actually gives me a handhold back into the workshop, rather than having to reinvent it all the next time I go down.
Right.
And then there's also some evaluation. So I never do this again appears a few times in my sketchbooks. Unfortunately, I never think to look back over them, so I never know when I've done it. When I do the detail again and I look back on it and it says this was far too fiddly last time, like, why am I doing it again?
Right.
I obviously didn't learn last time. Yes, everything. Sometimes it's even things like my blade show table layout, costings, that sort of thing. It's all there in my sketchbook.
Yeah. So it's really, so we used to use, not nearly as much anymore with computers, but once upon a time that was very common in my engineering world, that we had these engineer logbooks. And it reminded me a lot when I saw your sketchbook stuff on your Instagram, that I'm like, wow, this is just like one of our engineering logbooks, where it was the status of the project and a detail that needed to happen on a certain timing, maybe a sketch thrown in the middle. But it was all almost like a project plan type book as much as anything.
Part of this is the rigor that was introduced during my practice-based PhD, because if you are both the source of the information and the researcher looking at it, you have to divide yourself into two. And as a researcher, you can't imagine, you can only look at the stuff that you can evidence. So it's actually the discipline of documentation. It obviously suits my way of working because I've continued it, but that was also a fundamental part of my PhD work.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing to think about too, to your point about not having much in the way of, it's certainly compared to knife making anyway, the history and the process piece of things and the documentation to be able to go look at around work, or even many artists who don't keep great records of what they've worked on over time, for you to be able to sometime in the future, right? Maybe that becomes something that you can save or publish or somehow, you know what I mean? Like it's a much more permanent thing than, stuff like Instagram, or you know what I mean. Not that
And
those aren't wonderful
it
tools. But
saddens me when I see that if I go to somebody's workshop and there's like a pile of paper and there's like random bits of drawing on pieces of cigarette packets, and then they just get swept in the bin, and I just think,
yeah,
that might. You're going to have to expect that archaeologist to go through your bin now to
Right.
find that piece of.
yeah. There's a permanence thing that matters, right? And we've talked about that same thing before, where if you don't have that type of record,
But that makes it sound too precious, and as though it's kind of, I don't know, keeping it for future generations. It isn't really. It's just so that I don't lose myself by next week. And the fact that I keep my sketchbooks is only because I have a slightly obsessive personality.
right?
It's not. I'm not expecting them to be profound to anybody else apart from me.
No, I understand. I'm just saying that at least the fact that it exists in physical form is the opportunity that if you ever needed to or wanted to, or your kids wanted to, or whatever, they could go back and see that stuff. And when I think about the craftsman that you mentioned earlier, right, that's generational thing that happens, right, where by generation that history is dying off.
Yeah.
Obviously, I need to get this part done by next Tuesday and pick it up from the engineering shop. Okay, that's maybe not a historical thing, but
if you don't document anything, then there's nothing there for me to find.
Exactly. Yeah. In the absence of anything at all, then any of it's potentially valuable someday.
Yeah.
And I find it really fun just to look back through designs. I've got 20 years worth of notebooks and stuff, and I think it's interesting.
Do you know what surprises me when I look back over my sketchbooks is how early on I can trace themes that still interest me.
Right.
Obviously, at the time, I would have been interested in dozens of other things, and I wouldn't have thought, actually, circles in circles, that's still going to be interesting me in 20 years' time. But very often, if I look back in hindsight, I can see that things that interest me now interested me then as well.
Yeah, and I can sometimes when I look back through, it seems like there's a design that I've wanted to refine, and I've worked on it in different periods of time over and over until I end up getting it, it seems like.
Yeah. Yeah. Do other people do that? Do other people have projects in their head that they don't have the skills to do yet, that they're just shelving and waiting?
All the time.
Majority of my projects in my head.
I've got a question for you, Grace. When you're looking for inspiration for your next project, what grabs your attention? And it doesn't have to be in scissors or knives or whatever, but is it material focused, or is it lines or function, or what drives your interest?
Surprise. Very often it'll be something that's caught me by surprise, that either I've not noticed it before, so it could just be a little detail, or it could be a material that I like working in materials that don't necessarily belong in the field that we work in. So my boxes and that sort of thing, I use glove leather a lot, and as a material, it's absolutely extraordinary material to work with because it's very tough, very very thin, very flexible, and it's a wonderful material to work in. So the surprise of that and being able to draw that from a different field and use it in my own work, that excites me. I don't know what triggers an idea. I have more ideas that I'm never waiting on inspiration. There's always a lot of stuff that I'm wanting to explore. It doesn't necessarily mean it becomes a finished object. I might just play with it for a bit and then go, well, at some time in the future that might get incorporated into something. And it might be that 2 or 3 suddenly come together, and a material, a shape, and a concept might all suddenly come together. And I did a pair of scissors a few years ago with steel iron lace on the inside, and it was based on a pair of scissors that I'd seen in Sheffield Museum, which was the most amazing carved filigree lace work, but it was carved from a solid block of steel. And then there were some other scissors. They were quite small, those scissors. And then there were some other scissors which were exhibition grade scissors, showcase scissors. And the scissor makers had this opportunity to do these pieces for the great exhibitions. So they were taken off their general run-of-the-mill production stuff, and they were allowed to do these really quite elaborate, extraordinary pieces, sometimes oversized, but, sometimes usable, kind of, I don't know, building opening scissors or ribbon cutting scissors. And then I'd also become more aware of the domestic role of, or the role of women in the domestic life in scissor making in Sheffield. And these all came together, these ideas all came together in a single pair of scissors, where I wanted to make the scissors with lace, but not carved. I wanted to make lace out of iron wire. So I had to design a pair of scissors that protected these lace elements, which were obviously going to be quite delicate. They needed to not detract from the lace elements themselves. I needed to teach myself how to make bobbin lace, and then figure out how I was going to do that in iron. And that, so that's how like various things started to come together. And yeah, I ended up with a single set of scissors with these double pair of bound on iron lace. So yeah, that was actually featured in David Jerome's last book, which was kind of looking at the process of those.
I really like that answer.
What were those called? That set of scissors, sorry.
Iron light. I think they were called iron lace.
Iron lace, okay. We were just sharing in our group thing, the Twisted Seamstress, 2015. And it made me think of your question about a gender. And I look at that, and that looks like a very masculine design. And I don't know why. I can't pinpoint it. Why?
Now, dude, you see, I'm opposite end of the spectrum from you on that one. I thought that those were a very, very feminine design.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. And really, okay, for our listeners, the scissors are referred to as the Twisted Seamstress. They're from 2015. Find them and look at them. They are gorgeous. They're, I mean, just exceptional. When I saw them, I was just blown away.
The sheath for those, that's glove leather. So that's one of the kind of, the crossovers where my textile, well, actually, I make corsets as well, or I have made corsets in the past. So that was a kind of a crossover of my textile practice into my scissor making.
Do you think that, Sean and Michael, your kind of opposite spectrum takes on those are because of the scissors themselves versus the sheath? I mean, it's a very interesting piece of work where the scissors themselves, I could certainly see where that they have more of a masculine bend to them. Mm-hmm. In the sheath, right, you see that it's really part of an overall design or picture, and that's where it gets different. So maybe that's part of why you guys see them different ways.
And possible. I mean, the scissors themselves, I thought looked kind of feminine because they seem kind of slim, and the way the curves intersect, and I mean, certainly Mark, the sheath plays into it.
Right, obviously, yeah.
I think the scissors are very medieval dagger.
Oh, yeah, total poignard kind of thing going on. Or quill and dagger, I mean.
With those, I did quite a lot of research into, I'd heard about this idea of these bodice scissors, and kind of the idea of the medieval self-protection thing and all that. And then the more I looked into it, the more I realized that that was probably a myth. And the medieval reference, or the kind of the slight subtle references to the medieval dagger is quite deliberate. But I decided that it was still important for me to do my own take on it as well. So yeah, that was a really that I had to do quite a lot for my own interest. I had to do quite a lot of digging and historical investigation onto tracking back how much of this was a Victorian fabrication about medieval women and scissor daggers, and how much of it was actually likely to be true.
Yeah, interesting. One thing that's it makes me think about when I look at a piece like that, or like I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the piece, the scissors with the leather wrapped eyes.
The one I did last year with the big tailor's shears.
Yes. Where, you're doing these miniature scissors now, which I want to talk about a little bit, but there's a lot of this very small, super fine detail, even in pieces like Twisted Seamstress or the big shears that have the leather wrapped handles. There's a ton of very fine stuff, and maybe it's got that miniature-ish feel because it's another material. Maybe that's part of what makes me think of it that way, where even though there's obviously tiny, tiny detail in tons of places on your work, but I don't know, there's something fascinating.
I think that this is an inadvertent reference to the fact that I still function within a jewelry discipline.
Okay.
That this, even on a big piece, that little detail, I like to reward people for picking it up. So the fact that you see more detail, even on a big piece, the fact closer investigation reveals more details, more without it being overburdened. I don't want it to look too busy, but I want people to find pleasure in the little details as well.
Right. It's almost like the little Easter egg to maybe Easter egg is the wrong way to put it, but like realizing.
No, that's true. So even on my folding knives, I'd very often put file work on the inside of the springs, so that when people open them, they'd see.
Okay.
If they looked, and yeah, it's just a little reward for them interacting with it.
They're very interesting works because the scissors, I think, both obviously because of the work that you put into them and the beautiful design, but what I learned at Blade Show was you take great photos of them, you have nice images, and you show people the detail as you go through. And then when you see them in person, much like happens with knives, it's like, it goes fully 3D, and you start to really appreciate them much, 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 much more when you see them in person.
I think that's even more the case with the tiny scissors that I'm working on at the moment.
Oh, I bet.
I really, because I'm only ever taking photographs with my phone.
Right. Right.
And wonderful though that is, I don't think that actually captures just how delicate and fine they are. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's interesting because you'll see the work photos, and then I think you've done a good job of trying to help people understand by showing in hand or on a fingertip, or you know what I mean, to like, wow, that really is super tiny.
Mm-hmm.
So where did that come from? The tiny scissors? How did that happen?
Actually, okay, I don't keep any of my own work. I have no examples of my own work. So, and I decided that this year, given that there was every chance that I wouldn't be able to make any knife shows this year at all, that I was going to make a pair of scissors for myself. So, I quite liked the big Lotus scissors that I made last year. And I thought, actually, what I want is a pair of scissors that are small enough to fit in the finger bows of those that I could wear as a necklace. And I had a piece of Chad Nichols Damascus, stainless Damascus, and I was going to use that and try and replicate the big scissors. So can't remember how big they were, but the tiny little scissors that I've done are 1.25 inches, 1.5 overall length.
Yeah.
And as a kind of a proof of concept, really, I made a couple of pairs out of 01 just so that I could check that things were working. And yeah, and I managed to break one completely.
I saw that.
It was so close to being finished. Oh dear. But it's always the way. It was that by the time I'd filed and shaped the section, I'd obviously just gone a little bit too thin, and then when I tried to tweak it with pliers at the end, it went ping. Oh well, never mind. One of them survived.
Right.
And my stainless pair are pretty, yeah. So it's really a challenge. I always like doing small things, having said that jewellery isn't my thing. So I'm really waiting to finish the stainless ones because I was quite good about the 01 ones. They were kind of, okay, I've been using an optivisor on them. They'll do. They'll do. I'm quite happy to let them go like that. But I really need a microscope to finish the Damascus stainless ones that I'm going to keep for myself. I really want to see what they look like under the microscope before I say that they are finished.
Right.
Unfortunately, the microscope that I'm wanting to use is currently trapped inside the university and we don't have access to it. So I had to shelve it for a while. And I thought, do you know, this fits inside the bows of my big ones. I wonder, can I make a pair of working scissors that fit inside the bows of these tiny ones? So these are now tiny, tiny, tiny ones. So these have to be overall, they have to be 6 millimeters, which is a quarter of an inch.
That's insane.
And they're out of 440C, which was the only thing I had thin enough to use. And I've now rough cut them out. And I've got 3 possible pairs of those if I don't accidentally flick them across the workshop. And they now are also waiting for me to get the microscope because they are definitely too small for me to work with and just under the optivisor.
That is amazing.
But I'll heat treat those. It's important to me that they are real scissors, that they are not just scissor-shaped objects. So I think I'll stop there. That's as far. I'm not going to be doing kind of like even tiny, tiny, tinier scissors.
Oh, Joe's, yeah, right. You need an electron microscope to start those.
No, I think that's fine. I think I will say that anybody who made smaller scissors than that, and I do have a pair that are smaller, and I have no idea who made them. I got them, I've got tiny little folding knives, grain of rice knives, which are very traditional Sheffield, which used to be made by the apprentices. And I have a tiny pair of scissors, and I must just assume that they were 20-year-old eyes. They certainly weren't 50-year-old eyes that made them.
So if people want to see that, they can go to your Instagram feed. Your Instagram feed is at Grace_Horne, HORNE_designs. And Grace has a really cool picture from about 2 weeks ago. We'll share it in our group. Where she's holding them. Do you have them on a piece of wire, Grace? In the
yes, mainly because I kept flicking them across the workshop and losing them. So if they're on a piece of wire, then I have a chance of finding them again.
Yeah, right.
My workshop has been cleaned so often now on the search for these various tiny bits of things.
So you said they're going to be functional. How thin is the material? Your point about finding the right stock to do them from. I didn't even consider how thin they must be.
0.3 of a mil. So I don't know what that is in imperial, but
Crazy. 12,000s.
How do you not destroy them in heat treat? How does that not just get all warped and
I
get the
don't
right
know yet.
spring?
I shall let you know.
That's part of the fun,
Thank
Michael.
Way to jinx it.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know. I mean, your stainless steel heat treat foil doesn't disintegrate in heat treat.
No, I just mean like the warpage and possible.
Yes.
Just stop.
That. What?
Come on, Birch.
I'm thinking about this a little bit, but I think what I might do is the secret to putting the curve and the twist on the blades without using industrial equipment is that you pre-curve the blades before you heat treat them, and then you pack at the pivot point so that the tips just touch, the curve is maintained, and then you pack in between them with various blocks to maintain the curve. You bind them with binding wire, and then you heat treat and quench them so that the curve is kept constant. I suspect I might have to do something, but in tiny miniature for the miniature ones. That's what I had to do for the tiny ones that I've just done. What I might do is to hold them all together. I might be making tiny little stainless steel heat treat envelopes for them so that they're held in their own tiny pocket cavity in that. I don't know. We'll find out. They might just vanish in a puff.
That's crazy. Awesome.
Yeah, I think if people go to Grace's Instagram, it's a great spot to get a feel for the diversity of what she has going on. She mentioned corsetry. We didn't even touch that, which would be really interesting to do. She's got some fascinating and curiously perfect geometric pastry.
Yeah, sorry about the food. I might have to cut back on the food on the Instagram feed for a bit.
Oh yeah, no, never cut back on the food. We love food, but some of that food is so beautiful. It's nice. I'd be afraid to eat some of that stuff. What? I think we talked maybe before we started the incredibly precise shapes of the pastry are part of your family's contribution to those projects, right?
Yeah, I have my youngest daughter. Loves cooking, and so she joins me on the cooking. My oldest daughter is a mathematician. She's just about to go on to her master's program on maths, and she isn't a foodie. She's resistant to my need to feed her, which is why she's the size of an elf. And but she does. I can persuade her to join me in the kitchen if I can persuade her that the food is somehow mathematical. So we've just done these apple tarts where I got her to I'd cut the apple and put it in syrup overnight, so it was blackberry syrup, so they've gone dark, and then it gave her great delight putting all the pieces of apple in sequential size and then breaking them down so that she could take them in the right order and positioning them on the tart base. So we did that together, though she's very competitive and has told me that her 6 tarts are better than my 6 tarts. Have I never seen a rose before in my life, because they're rose shaped now at the end of it. And we also did a rhubarb tart where all the segments tessellate. I made a jig in the kitchen so that all the rhubarb was the right size and all cut at the right angle. And then she had great fun laying them out and making sure that they all went in the right direction. Yeah.
Nice.
It's making the most of the resources that I've got around me, see.
Absolutely. No, the idea of a kitchen jig makes me swoon. I love that. That's fascinating. So, Grace, we're pretty far in. We're past the 2-hour point.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's fascinating.
No.
And I think we have other stuff that we wanted to talk about. One of the things
you haven't even been able to get in with half of your questions. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. It's been very, very, very good.
No, actually, a lot of them got handled organically. They just came up.
They really did. Yeah, one of the things that we do with the show, we try to put this thing out every other week. We're terrible about it, so we don't really do it every other week, but every few weeks we put a new show out. We have some folks through this Patreon website who support the show, and they donate money to keep things going on the show and pay for equipment and stuff, which has been really wonderful. And we have a Patreon tier where we call them collaborators, and folks can participate sometimes. And so we told them that you were going to come on with us, and Matthew from that group, we said, hey, if you have questions that you'd like to have answered or topics that you'd like to include in the discussion, let us know, right? We'd be happy to try to, sometimes we don't think of everything to talk about.
What a lovely idea. Yeah.
So Matthew asked one of the questions, like Sean said, you hit many of the points that he threw out there, which is awesome. But one of the things that he asked was what your favorite project to date has been.
Oh, that's a horrible question.
It's like picking your favorite child kind of thing.
It has to be the project that I'm working on at the moment.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that's a shifting target, because I'm fully invested in every project that I do at the time. When I come to finish my projects, I universally hate them. I'm devastated by the project by the time I finish it. And this kind of goes back to a question that I think you asked about which bit of the process do people not like doing?
Right.
For me, it's a sharpening. And that is because it's always the last thing that I do. And at the point where I sharpen, whether it be my knife or my scissors, it means that it's finished and that it is never going to be the perfection that I have in my head.
Yeah.
It's never going to live up to it. It's always going to be a pale physical artifact in comparison. Now, it doesn't take long for the object itself to override that unrealistic image that I have in my head.
Right.
Yeah, so it's that point at which the most vulnerable time for any of my pieces is that point when I've realised that they just never have the potential to live up to the perfection that exists in my head. So I've got any number of projects that have been finished all bar the sharpening because they just haven't met it. But absolutely, my favourite project is the project that I'm working on at the time.
Okay.
And I sound like a mother who's been asked which child they love the most, don't I?
Do you think, I know you mentioned that the Lotus scissors, that's part of what you chose for your miniature project. That was one that you look back on as a fond creation.
Yes. Yeah, they are. I mean, they weren't particularly technically challenging to make, but they have been. I suspect that they're going to be quite. They're going to be a shape. Well, I've come back to them a couple of times now, so I obviously do like them. But that'll probably, by the time I've done the tinies, then that's probably it on that. I'll move on to something else.
Right. The one I think, if I was picking a recent project of yours that I really liked, I think it would be the scissors. I'm not sure what the name is for these. I think they were from last year as well. They had almost like a very feminine corsetry sort of shape in the center at the connection point, and then two curving legs that go up to the bows.
Oh, yes. Yeah. They didn't have a name.
Okay. They're beautiful though. I love them.
They were I try and make some scissors every few years that are a little bit more pragmatic. So they're not, so that they're, as far as price goes as well, and size. So they're not, so people who use scissors might want to buy them and use them as scissors rather than put them in a display case.
Right.
And that was part of that range, really, that I was exploring a mid-size shape. They're very delicate. I don't do, the question I get asked the most is whether I do hairdressing scissors. And I just don't. I don't do hairdressing scissors. I know nothing about hair cutting. Mine are mainly craft, paper, fabric scissors, general purpose scissors. I'll probably do. I've got some male grooming scissors. Yeah, for those nose hair cutters. Oh yeah. Actually, the only reason why they're male grooming scissors is because somebody pointed out that my bows are generally too small for big fat fingers to go through. So I'm going to be doing some relatively small scissors with bigger bows, so that potentially those people with wider fingers can use them.
I think the ones I liked, maybe it's just because they are, they're much simpler than some of the things that you do, but they're, I don't know, I just love the shapes. I think the shapes are beautiful, and there's some simplicity, elegant simplicity kind of thing going on with them that I really, really like.
Yeah, and there are shapes that I'll go back to and do modifications on, and I suspect that 6-inch size with the waist in the center of the around the pivot point, and then the slight swelling of it's a very satisfying shape, I think.
Yeah. I think I know which pair Michael really likes, but which are your favorites, Michael, of Grace's recent work?
Well, I don't know. It's hard. Like those Lotus ones, they looked very elegant. I like the texture of them that you've done on some of them. I like how they don't just flow in a 2-dimensional way. They go inward and outward. But I really like the new ones you're making, the ones you call the calligraphy ones. I like the difference in how they look and how it flows together.
Yeah, they're going to be. I think they're going to be. I'm really quite excited about them. Yeah.
I was sure Michael was going to say the Mokame desk scissors. I think.
Oh, I want those. Those are the ones I want. But as far as pure design, it's just, I don't know. A lot of them hit different aspects to me.
Yeah, for sure.
I like the ones that, in more of a Art Deco ones you've done that are, it looks like you've only done a proof of concept so far, but they open up and, let me see, what are they called? A nesting pair. Where they open and then they open again. It's very streamlined. It's very almost Art Deco. I love that idea.
What about you, Sean? If you we're shopping in Grace's world where none of these are sold, obviously. So where would you go, Sean, if you were picking a pair?
Oh, dude, I want those twisted seamstress scissors.
Yeah.
Those are killer. And they're multitaskers.
Multitaskers, yes. Sean is a fan of I would guess he loves the daggery aspect of that.
Yes,
package.
yes. If I can snip a thread and fuck somebody up, hell yeah.
Said as only Sean can say it. What about you, Tom?
So looking through the Instagram feed, I really like the sprung scissors. I think they're maybe a snip, actually. I don't know, but seems like they've got blades in the handle and some other stuff like that. This is from a while back. Do you know what I'm talking about, Grace?
Are they little?
Yeah, and they're like square. The handles are really square, and they've got like implements in the handles.
Oh yes, I know those. That was a tragic project.
It seems like they broke or something, right?
Oh yes, that was another one that I used the wire EDM for. I'd forgotten about those. Yeah, they were. Oh, I just discard those. That's one that's sitting there. There was a flaw in the Damascus.
Yeah,
and it was entirely my fault. That was a pair of scissors that had a folding blade in each of the handles of it snips, you're right. And then they had little slots for needles to go in.
Yeah, I really loved those.
They were lovely. Oh, they had such potential. Heartbreaking. And then I packed between each layer so that I made them out of a square bar of twisted Damascus. And then as I cut them all down, and it was really complicated series of cuts, and then I packed in between each cut with gold so that the all the twist then realigned itself. You've just brought all the pain back to me there.
I absolutely loved that project though, and when the Damascus broke, I was really bummed. I'm sure you were too. But to me, those were I loved everything about them, the size and the intricacy and all the little details in the handle.
Yeah, I should probably dig out the near finished piece and have a look at it. Depends how brave I'm feeling.
How much your emotions can handle.
Yeah.
I bet Tom likes that piece partly because he's a multi-tool guy.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
So,
Well, and they're just so functional, but
yeah.
the detail and the thought that went into it, I mean, they're just a working piece of art.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the way they all are.
Oh,
right?
for sure.
So, Grace, I think it's probably a good time for us to stop, but we would love to have you come back. We have lots of other questions about other things that you've worked on, and we'd like to talk a bit about Sheffield as well, some of the historical piece of this. Hopefully
That'd
this...
be lovely.
Oh, good. I was choosing to say, no way, get the hell out of here, guys, you knuckleheads. So yeah, if we could do that, that'd be fantastic. Very good conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. This is really an honor for us.
No,
Yeah,
thank you for being an audience and letting me just blab at you, really.
Happy to listen.
What were you going to ask, Tom?
Well, one of the things that she mentioned was an exhibition piece of shears or scissors, and that made me think of a book, and I was going to see what her thought was on it. It's the exhibition knives of the Joseph Rogers and Sons. Have you looked at that book
Yeah,
at all?
I have it. Mm-hmm.
It's wonderful, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I really love that. That book is very inspiring to me, and lots of beautiful pieces. And to think that these cutlers would have spent like a year of their time building these knives for like the world fairs and stuff like that.
And I think it's wonderful they were given the opportunity to do that, because most of the time they would have been on kind of piecework, and they would have been the high end of the, in the company, but still they would have been expected to be churning stuff out, and to have been told that they could be working on a project for a year or more. It must have been a real boost for them.
When I look at that book and some of the knives, it's like, how did they do it with the tools they had at the time?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Absolutely.
Can you say the name of the book again, Tom?
It's the Exhibition Knives of Joseph Rogers and Sons.
Okay.
If you don't have the book, I highly recommend it. It's a really wonderful book. Great pictures. A lot of history.
I think you've talked before, Tom, maybe specific to Sheffield, about exhibition stuff for these big shows and stuff, right?
Yeah.
We've talked about that here a couple times.
One to add to the list.
Yeah, exactly. We've been on
I saw you got a bunch of books, Michael.
Some of mine haven't been showing up, but yeah, I've been found a place to buy a bunch of them cheap, so I'm buying them up
Saw what
before.
you paid for them.
Yeah. Michael got me started too, so we're both library building at the moment, which hopefully is a good thing. Certainly good for the show.
And you can call it's insulation, wall insulation.
Yes.
Right.
You can never go wrong with a book.
Right. We could always heat the house if we needed to, if it came right down to it.
No, not with the books, bro.
Oh,
No.
yeah. Sorry. All right. Well, Grace, thank you very much again for taking the time to chat with us and sharing some of your own personal history and talking more about some of your projects. It's something, your work has come up many times on the show, so it's very cool to bring it full circle and have you actually join us.
Thank you. It's been an absolute joy.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So as usual, like we said, we'll get Grace to come back and join us again, and we'll dig in a little deeper and talk about some other stuff, her corsetry work and some other cool things that she's shown on her feed and some stuff that she's worked on over time. And we'll also spend some time talking about Sheffield as well. So we'll get that together and bring the crew of us here back together for another conversation. As I mentioned earlier, we have these folks on Patreon who support us and send us some money to help keep the show going. So high five to that crew of people. We appreciate you and your contributions to keep us in motion. And we have an Instagram feed that we'll obviously link Grace's stuff to. I think we actually have in the past as well, but we'll do that again and get some people pointed your direction to look at your work. It's always really helpful for people. We oftentimes record the show and it feels like the worst podcast ever because we are together looking at photos of stuff and it's audio. So we share lots of links with people to try to help point them to what they heard us talk about. And kind of to your comment earlier about putting people to sleep and including a warning, we have started now talking about whether a show has a deep Google content where we're going to talk about a lot of things on the show. Please don't listen while you're driving, because people will, end up trying to look things up. They'll stop by the side of the road. We get all kinds of crazy stories about stuff. So we'll send a link over and share that so folks can check out your work for anyone who hasn't already seen it. And we have a good Facebook group as well. Facebook group is awesome. There's lots of good conversation there. We talk about things that have happened on the show. People will share examples. We've talked about historical knives and makers, and it's really cool to see kind of what comes out of the woodwork with our listeners. Sometimes there's some very interesting historical pieces that show up, and we have good conversation about them. So,
and please, if anybody has any scissor questions or they fancy making any, then get in contact with me. I'm always happy to share information. And if you see me at a show, stop and talk, because actually that's the pleasure. That's why we go to shows.
Definitely.
Yes.
Yep.
What are shows?
Yeah. Hopefully we get back to them here. When things settle down, we'll get everyone back together again.
Can't wait.
Yep. All right. Well, that's it. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks all.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
To learn more about our makers, you can find Tom Crine on the web at crineknives.net, in his Facebook group, Crine Knives, or in his Instagram account at Crine Knives. For Michael Birch, check birchtreeblades.com, Facebook group Birch Tree Blade Works, or Michael's Instagram at birchtreeblades. For myself and the Raygun Bead Project, we're on the web at raygundivision.com. We have a Facebook group called Raygun Division, or my personal Instagram at msteiner. For those interested in photos, references from the show, or some discussion about the show itself, you can find us on the web at markofthemaker.com, in a Facebook group called Mark of the Maker, or on our Instagram at Mark of the Maker. Last but not least, the ultra cool and haunting background music we use for the show is a piece called Noir Guitar by Stevie's Amp Shack, found at the Free Music Archive and licensed under Creative Commons CC BY 4.0. Thanks for listening.